Welcome to Africa.com's Doing Business in Africa podcast. I'm Lerato Molefe, and I want to start today by looking at two very different things happening at the exact same time. First, picture the Strait of Hormuz, tankers navigating through one of the most tense geopolitical flashpoints in the world right now, with US-Iran signals sending shockwaves through global energy markets. Now, look roughly 3,000 miles southwest to a conference hall in Kenya. The Africa Forward Summit. 30 African heads of state are in the room. French President Emmanuel Macron is there. And while the rest of the world is bracing for the fallout from Hormuz, the people in this room are targeting a completely different kind of crisis. They are going after the sovereign risk premium. If you're an investor or an executive, that phrase, risk premium, is the invisible ceiling on everything you do in Africa. It's the extra interest governments and corporations have to pay simply because of where they are on the map. But what we saw in Nairobi this week was a coordinated challenge to how global markets price African risk. And it wasn't just talk. The immediate, concrete wins coming out of this summit are staggering. We're talking about 104 billion, that's nearly 800 million US dollars, in newly inked logistics deals alone. But Kenya didn't just host the party. They overhauled the plumbing to make sure the capital actually flows. They pushed through the Technopolis and Special Economic Zone Acts, which are specifically designed to strip away the regulatory friction that usually scares off foreign capital. It's one thing to ask for investment. It's another to actually rewrite your laws to accommodate it. And this leads to the Nairobi Declaration. This isn't just a regional policy paper. It's a strategic battering ram aimed directly at the upcoming G7 summit in Evian. The leaders in Nairobi are demanding structural credit rating reform. Because if you change the sovereign rating, you lower the borrowing costs for every single corporation operating on the continent. You change the math on infrastructure, on tech, on agriculture. Now, if you want to see what happens when you do get the math right, you just have to look at the earnings reports that dropped this week. The structural shifts in telecoms and energy right now are just massive. Let's look at Airtel Africa, a 147% profit jump. 147%. And right alongside them, Safaricom is handing out a record dividend. Why? Because the growth engine has fundamentally shifted. It's no longer just about selling voice minutes. The absolute lifeblood of these telecom titans is mobile money and data. They are functioning as the de facto financial infrastructure for millions of people. And speaking of scale, we have to talk about Ethiopia. For years, the narrative around Ethiopia, a market of over 120 million people, was that it was a financial drag, weighed down by conflict and closed systems. This week, they secured $13 billion in investment deals. $13 billion. They are pivoting from being viewed as a political risk to becoming a primary investment magnet in East Africa. The sheer volume of that capital inflow changes the regional balance of economic power. But growth always hits a bottleneck. And in Africa, that bottleneck is usually power. Which brings us to Aliko Dangote. We all know the Dangote name, but the target his group just announced is breathtaking. 20,000 megawatts of power generation. To put 20,000 megawatts into perspective, that is essentially double the current operational capacity of Nigeria's entire national grid. He is trying to build a shadow grid of private power. And this is happening in the lead-up to what is easily the most watched IPO on the continent, the public listing of the Dangote mega refinery. The ambition is incredible, but the tension between building a 20,000 megawatt private empire and the reality of Nigeria's fragile public infrastructure is going to be the defining business story of the year. So how does this all tie back to what we're seeing globally? While we're seeing slightly easing oil prices right now, the transmission mechanisms of global conflict are still very real. If you want to know if the Hormuz crisis matters, just look at the fuel pumps in South Africa, where prices are constantly reacting to those geopolitical tremors. But there's a counter-narrative building on the ground. As traditional currencies and fuel prices fluctuate, we're seeing rapid adoption of stablecoin payment systems, tools like MiniPay, designed specifically to bypass that macro-level volatility. People are finding ways to root around the friction. We're watching a continent actively trying to reprice its own risk on the global stage, while simultaneously building the infrastructure, the telecoms, the power grids, the digital wallets, to insulate itself from global shocks. The question for investors isn't just whether the G7 will listen at Avian. It's whether they can afford to ignore a market where telecom profits are jumping 147%, while the rest of the world is busy looking at the Strait of Hormuz.